Okay, it is an honor to talk to you. I think you are such a badass. Like, I'm just very excited about this. So thank you for doing it.
I'm so
My
excited to
first
be here.
question. Oh, sorry. Okay, great. My first question, and then I'm going to want to go back and get into like who you are, where you came from. I want to talk about your family in Pittsburgh. I want to talk about the New York Times. I want to know everything about the Slack channel inside the New York Times. And then obviously what you're doing next. But my first question is, what is it about you that pisses people off so
You'd
much?
have to tell me because this is the first question everyone asks me, including at this point my own family. Um, and it's a mystery to me. The closest thing that I've the closest answer that I've come to that seems somewhat plausible is that, in a lot of ways, I look like I should have a certain set of political ideas. I live in those kinds of neighborhoods. I eat at those kinds of restaurants. I'm married to a woman. I'm politically progressive. If you kind of look down the list of issues that I care about, on many of them, I'm progressive. But I think because of the fact that there's something in my personality that is somehow contrarian or not willing to go along with every tenet of what I think of as this new orthodoxy or this new dogma, almost like a new religion. I think there's special outrage and anger reserved for those people, even more so than there are for those that are wearing a MAGA hat.
Yeah, you're
I
confusing.
think so.
And you are, I think you're confusing. You look like you should be one thing. And then when you look at the boxes you check, you definitely should be the thing. And you're like, no, I'm not really that. I also think you seem like a person who's not, you don't really give a fuck. So you're not going to be defined by what everybody else thinks you should be,
Yeah,
anyways. And you're
thank
smart.
you. I mean, at this point, I don't really give a fuck. If you had talked to
Yeah.
me a few years ago, I was much more crouched and much more scared because I felt like I had to cling to the certain world that I thought was the only world that I could live in and work in and date in and be a part of. And now, like Barstool being an amazing example of this, it's clear to me that we're living in a time where new worlds are being created and, that it became more of an option for me to peace out.
Okay, so Barry, let's talk about that. Like, give us the Cliff Notes version, and for people who aren't familiar with you, give the sense of your former career and trajectory.
So you might know me as the girl that like Jerry Maguired my way out of the New York Times with it. Probably, if you know anything about me, it's that I wrote a, a resignation letter that
Slight,
I'm pretty damn proud
slightly
of.
public resignation letter.
Yeah. So the short answer is I'm pretty boring, to be honest with you. I'm the oldest of four daughters. I grew up in the Jewish community of Pittsburgh. My parents are high school sweethearts. My dad's a political conservative. My mom is a liberal. I left Pittsburgh, went to Columbia University, started sort of writing then inadvertently. I hadn't planned on being a writer. I thought maybe vaguely I'd be a lawyer. But long story short, I was super politically active at Columbia. I used to debate campus socialists and things like that. I found out about this internship at the Wall Street Journal through a very serendipitous story in which Bret Stephens, who was my colleague at the Journal and then my colleague later at the New York Times, his father showed up at one of my debates and told me about this thing called the Wall Street Journal, which I had really not read. I thought it was just a financial newspaper, and told me I should go intern there. And that was really the start of my journalism career. So I spent a bunch of years at the Wall Street Journal, both on the op-ed page where I was an op-ed editor and then on the book review section. And for people who don't read it, it's, the only conservative editorial page in the country. And I was very much seen as sort of the leftmost flank, crazy, in the context of the Wall Street Journal, Bernie type person. I was seen as the squish. And then following the sort of shocking, at least in the context of the New York Times, election of Donald Trump, I was kind of an intellectual diversity hire. So I went from being the leftmost flank of a conservative editorial page to the rightmost flank inside the context of the New York Times, which if you spent any time actually in this country, the idea that I would be on the right of anything seems crazy. But that's where our institutions are. So suffice it to say, I came there super pumped. Like this was a
So
huge
can I
opportunity.
interrupt you,
Sure.
Barry? Did you think you were a token hire, and did you care?
Like a token CEO, you might say.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah,
Dun-dun-dun.
yes. I mean, people at the paper thought, wait, our job is to tell people about the world as it is, not the world as they wish it would be. Our job is to hold up a mirror to the country, not just hold up a mirror to Brooklyn and the Upper West Side and Berkeley. So let's bring in, let's first of all cover things differently. And let's also bring in people on the editorial page and the op-ed section who can solicit pieces from people with alternative points of view, people who might think to themselves, the New York Times would never allow my view in there. So that was my job. My job was to bring in obviously to write my own pieces, but the majority of my job was to bring in pieces from people who would not otherwise appear in the New York Times. Heterodox thinkers, libertarians, conservatives, high schoolers, first-time writers, people like that. So did I have a trouble being an intellectual token? Not really. I mean, it's the New York Times.
No, you're like that's my job. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, even if you hate the New York Times and you think it's, lying and you think it's a mouthpiece of the Democratic Party, whatever you think, it's still the New York Times. It's still the most powerful amplification system in the world. And so the opportunity to share my views, let alone bring in views that wouldn't otherwise appear in there, better believe I leapt at that opportunity.
So you take advantage of it. Like, does someone eat lunch with you on the first day, or was it like daggers from the minute you walked in?
I mean, there were certainly people there who were lovely, and one of them being my wife, who I met at the New York Times. So, I mean, I'll always be eternally grateful for meeting her. I met her on the 5th floor in the little coffee cafeteria room. So there's plenty of people that I like at the New York Times, and there's plenty of journalists who I deeply admire at the New York Times. I wouldn't know about what's going on in places like China or Afghanistan if it weren't for the New York Times. So there's so many good things I can say. And one of the reasons that I am so pained about what's going on there is precisely because I think it's such an important institution. But no, Erika, from the beginning, there were gradations, right? There were certain people who were nice to me, other people who treated me sort of like a curiosity. And then, unfortunately, there were colleagues of mine who, had no hesitation to openly smear me or, when they were being nice, subtweet me on Twitter. And, there were certain colleagues who refused to speak to me the whole time I worked there.
And how did you develop thick skin on that? Are you the same person you were
No.
6 years ago? How are you different?
Well, I mean, there's obviously if I look back on my life, there is something consistent in my personality, whether or not that personality is nature or the value my parents raised me with. I'm sure it's a combination of the two. Allowed me to go against the grain in many areas of my life. I would definitely say that was a consistent theme, but I would be lying to you if I didn't say that the kind of pressure that I experienced in that context, and certainly online, and the way that I became a kind of, avatar or two-dimensional version of myself on the internet is extremely painful. I mean, anyone that's lived through any kind of enormous public criticism or even public shaming will tell you that there's something almost physical about it. So am I different now? Of course I'm different now. I care less about what people think, which I think is a good thing. I think the thing that I try and protect myself from doing, and I see that this has happened to many, many people I know who have, been feature characters in the online culture war, is that you want to try not to harden yourself and close your mind and without sounding cheesy about it, harden your heart. And it's very important to me that I remain vulnerable and remain open, and I'm capable of changing my mind. And one of the things that I think is scary about the current cultural context that we're living in is that there's no room for second chances. There's no room for evolution. There's no room for forgiveness. Everything that you've done for all of your life, especially for those digital natives like the Gen Z people, it's there forever. And it's just not healthy to live in that kind of panopticon. Can I say that that I'm somehow floating above it? No, I'm as victim to it, and as victim's not the right word. I'm as subject to it as any other human being.
Yeah, it's interesting, the dichotomy of Also, your vocabulary is amazing. But the dichotomy of wanting to stay open and vulnerable and in touch, right? Because I think that is something of what you did bring to the Times, is you could access a part of the world, and frankly, not the world, this country, that they could not see. Like the Times has, in my opinion, lost eyes for reality in some ways, because it doesn't fit the definition and the narrative, which I want to get to in a second. But the juxtaposition between staying open and being vulnerable is an invitation for mistake. And that yet we live in a world where you can't make mistakes. Like, how do you stay open now? Like, how you've been through a war to a degree that I think is very hard to describe. But how do you do it? What would your advice to other people be?
I would not say that I've lived through a war. I mean, any more than like AOC lived through a war on January 6th. But was that traumatizing? Yes. Did I live through some kind of trauma? Yes. But I also, and this is one of my answers to your question, like, I really try and keep it in perspective. And, when I think about my life and the freedoms that I have and the opportunities that I have, like, in the span of like American history, Jewish history, human history, I'm like,
yeah, like you're
I'm
okay.
the luckiest person that ever lived. Like, I can wear a tank top and be married to my wife and walk down the street and not get stoned. That is a much better position than the vast majority of people in the world. And I think one of the problems right now is that, and it's understandable, like we are genuinely living in information revolution that's transforming our brains and transforming the way we relate to each other and transforming what it means to be human. The last big time that happened, like 14th century printing press, like it led to massive seismic changes and major world wars. So it is very normal that we would be having, a reaction and a major shift given this device we're talking to each other through right now. That said, like, I think it's important to keep perspective. I think it's important to root down into real life. Like, there's something about this that is both amazing and also extremely flattening, and people become like sort of like a slice of themselves rather than a whole person. And so I think part of it is like being as much in real life as possible, feeling being connected to community and family and friends. That's like, I couldn't maintain my sanity, let alone like be involved in the controversial topics that I am without that. But like everyone else, I'm really trying to figure it out, because it's really hard how do you resist the algorithm? Like, it's like saying to someone, like, stand alone on a beach and a tsunami is just going to come hit you again and again and again, but just stand up. Like, it's an impossible ask.
Stay upright.
It's not possible. What we can do is look back at history, understand the things that have generally worked for human beings in the past, and try as much as we can to anchor ourselves in those qualities and in those virtues. Like, let me say one more thing on this. I find it very strange that in the year 2021, I need to be going out in public making the argument that people should be judged not based on the sins of their parents, not based on the amount of melanin in their skin, not based on their group identity, but based on who they are as people. Like, that suddenly has become an argument that needs to be made, because that very basic thing that so many Americans fought and died to make real is now under siege again. Like, I don't know if people have fully appreciated the extent to which, like, liberalism broadly defined, like those kind of values, second chances, mercy, justice, proportion, that those are the things that are under siege. And like, if I really get to the kind of like root of why I had to leave the New York Times, beyond the bullying and beyond the self-censorship and all the things I'm sure we'll talk about, it's that I feel that the fight for those values is the fight of our lifetime. And I knew that I couldn't wage that battle inside an institution that had already capitulated to the ideology.
Very well put. So talk about what you're doing now and how you are going to fight for those values. Like talk about, what's interesting to me about the New York Times a little bit is the hypocrisy that the New York Times is about truth. Right. When you look at the advertisements for the New York Times, if you're at a bus stop or you're reading the full print ad, they're only in New York City and Berkeley, to your point. But the second is they market themselves as a source of truth. But in reality, I think your experience was frankly nearly opposite to that. And I think what's interesting about brands like Barstool and us and me is that, no one here ever said they were a journalist. No one here ever said we were an authority on anything. But yet we were very real and authentic and earnest to a degree about how we covered it, and we understood the audience and what the audience wanted. So how do you think about the transition that you've now made to Substack and your podcast? Like, are you like, wow, I could be a bigger force here than I could inside the Gray Lady? Like, talk about that transition.
Well, to your point, I would say that part of the confusion and maybe even grief that people are feeling is that it's not just the New York Times, it's publishing houses, it's Harvard, it's Yale, it's all of these institutions that still have the same font or logo or, high-minded slogan, like that on the surface, they seem to be what they've always been. But if you look under the hood, they've transformed themselves. And in the case of the Times, the slogan is still all the news that's fit to print, but you just pick it up and you know that it's actually all the news that fits the narrative. The slogan is the truth is hard and we need to track it down and, we need to strive for it, even if it's inconvenient. That's not actually the slogan, but it's basically like that. And the truth is more something like we're MSNBC in print. And in the exact same way that Fox gives its viewers a heroin hit of their, brand of, political drug, that's what the New York Times has become. The tragedy of this is like, you guys and Rogan, like you say you're not authoritative, you say you're not journalists, and you are something different. The problem is we actually need journalism. Like we need to know what's going on in Uyghur concentration camps. We need to know what's going on inside Apple, what's going on inside Google, what's going on in these major forces that are shaping the world that we live in. And so one of like the great efforts I think of this age needs to be, how can we rebuild institutions that are immune to the takeover of this ideology, that can stay true to the values of, pursuing the truth, and that are authoritative? Like what happens in a world where there are no sources of authority? Well, we know what it is, because no one trusts the CDC, because no one trusts the New York Times, because no one trusts, we could go down the list, politicians, etc. Like, it's not a great situation. It feels like we're in this like world that's being retribalized. And I think that's really dangerous. The part that I'm trying to play in the little way that I am so far, is I'm trying to kind of pick up that flag that I feel like has been put down by so many others. And it's beginning with a newsletter, and I'm launching a podcast shortly that tries to have honest conversations, that tries to tell stories that are inconvenient, that tries to look at things even when they're ugly and try to understand what's really driving them. Like super basic in a way, but that's what I'm trying to do. And if I'm successful, I hope that the newsletter and my podcast are really only the beginning of that effort.
And what do you think happens with the Times?
I think in general,
as that ilk, right?
Yeah.
Tradition.
So I think what happens to the Times is that, its business model is really working for it. If let's just think about it, right? We're living in a world where everyone has to please their audience and everyone has to engage their audience. Well, should we be surprised that in that world, in which something like between 90 and 95% of New York Times readers identify as Democrats or liberals, that they're going to run still into the Biden administration op-eds about Donald Trump? Of course not. Any more than we should be surprised that Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity are going to want to do stories about campus.
Everybody knows their audience.
It's all the same model, right? And like no one's come up with a good solution yet to that model. I feel it even in myself, right? I know the kind of stories that I can run on my newsletter that are going to be red meat for my readers. And the question is like, how does anyone resist like being captured by their audience? It takes a tremendous amount of discipline. I do not think the New York Times is turning around. I think it's going to go further and further and further down this direction. And I think it's important. I think the good thing that will happen is that a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, no one's going to pretend anymore that it's the paper of record. That gap between the advertisement and the truth is going to become more clear. And I think people are going to appreciate, this is a paper you read if you're a coastal liberal elite, in the same way that like if you pick up, the Daily Mail versus the Guardian in England, those are two different kinds of people. And maybe that's better. Maybe that kind of honesty is better.
Do you think there's a market for what you have to say? Like if, Fox is catering to one side of the aisle, the Times is catering to the other, you want to live without a box, right? You're living in the middle. You want to bring in diverse points of view. Why is that? What I think is going to be interesting is, can that audience in the middle be super served, right? Like people, when they attack us, they say that there's the Barstool Republicans, right? Which is basically to say young, disenfranchised white men. And I'm like, look, there's a great business to be built for young, disenfranchised white men and women and young, disenfranchised people in general, which is, I think, where you're going. So how will you run your future media empire in a way where you don't fall into those traps?
Well, that's why I want to talk to you. I want your advice. I've never tried to build a business of my own. I guess I would say that what I'm doing now is the same thing that I did at the Times, but I'm doing it on my newsletter, and it's doing unbelievably well so far, like well beyond my expectations. And I mean, maybe this is going to sound radical to people, but I just really believe that the world of these 20th century institutions is not going to be the world of the 21st century. And when I look and see, like, it's like, just pick up the New York Times, right? Like I remember at the height of this summer, one of the cover business stories was about the cultural appropriation of tiki bars. Like, there's still a popular feature that's like, what did you miss last night on late night? Like, I don't know a single person that watches those shows. And
Nobody's
yet, like, the only piece that ran in the paper on Rogan was an interview that I did with him after the acquisition by Spotify. Like, he has more cultural power and cachet than every single person combined on CNN. So, like, that's where the world is going. When it comes to journalists, like present company excluded, some of the most interesting, independent-minded, like enterprising reporters and commentators, they're not in the institutions, they're on Substack. So like, what would a world look like where there was more of like a federation of those kind of independent-minded journalists? That's where I'm sort of like looking toward. The question is like, how do you build something with a lot of disagreeable, heterodox, contrarian people? Because the very thing that makes us immune to being swept along by whatever prevailing orthodoxy, the very thing that made us self-deport from that world, is also the thing that makes it hard for us to collaborate with one another.
To unify completely. Are you selling t-shirts yet?
No, but I need swag, don't I?
You need to have a t-shirt. You need to be like, I'm with Bari, or what's your thing? Like, you got to have it for a t-shirt.
It's common sense. I mean, it's news for
you got to ignite your cult. Okay, what is it, Bari? Hit me with your.
I'll give you a few things because I'm not settled yet.
Okay, it's got to be short, Bari. It's got to fit on a t-shirt.
Reality-based community. Okay.
No.
Common sense for normal people.
That works.
Fearless.
How about like a checkbox common sense?
Okay, I love it. See, this is why I need you. I need to talk
Okay, this
to
is
the
great.
token
We should
CEO.
make you a t-shirt line.
I need t-shirts.
You should have a t-shirt line.
I need t-shirts. I need hats. I need all the swag. Like, honestly, for right now, I'm just like dealing with a gusher of stories that in any normal situation would be appearing in places like the Washington Post and CNN and the New York Times. And like me and my like little staff of consulting editors need to put it out on my Substack. So
Do you have like a tips line? Is that how you're like, are you still a feeder? You're just a feeder for yourself. Do you have a tips
Yeah,
line?
I mean, the tips line is my inbox and my email.
Okay,
Yeah,
great. Is it
it's
called
called
tips?
barryweiss@gmail.com for now, but we're
Okay,
working
great.
on
There we
getting an
go.
official tips line because I just can't keep up. And some of them I farm out.
Hmm.
Like there's too many stories that are just not being covered and too many scoops. So some of them I give to people like broadly inside of that independent network that I'm referring to.
Barry, you're gonna have
You
really big
think?
business. Yeah,
I
I
hope
do.
so.
I think you need a business person. You hired your sister from the
She's the
Post.
best.
What's it like working with your
She's
sister?
amazing. She's brilliant. So I hired my sister from the Post, who's like she's just an incredible reporter and she's extremely funny. And then I also hired another New York Times refugee, Andy Mills, who built a lot of the podcasts at the New York Times. So, like going back to a question you asked before about like what has allowed me to have thick skin, I grew up in a mixed marriage. Like my dad's a conservative, my mom's a liberal. My mother withheld sex in 2016 and in 2020 to make sure my dad wouldn't vote for Trump, and he like wrote in Steph Curry or my mom or something. Like that's the family context that I'm coming from. So I'm extremely comfortable like disagreeing with people and like loving them at the end of the day. And it terrifies me that that is now something that seems endangered in this country. And I just think most Americans love people that disagree with them. And I think most Americans are what I think of as like purple people. Like they're not deep red, they're not deep blue, they're somewhere in the middle. They take things issue by issue. And they don't want to live in a world where everyone's divided according to who they vote for and like whether or not they have pronouns in their bio.
Why do you think there's such a witch hunt for purity and just this severe alignment? And where does that come from? Like you talk about it as like liberalism, but where does that come from? Like I feel it. I've stepped in shit so many times here in the last 6 years, and it's like sometimes I'm like I literally just trying to buy lunch for a hockey team, but apparently I'm a misogynist. But like how to me, I just am always mystified that the idea of being politically correct actually means being pure. And I don't believe that anyone is pure. I think everyone makes mistakes. I think being flawed is the most beautiful thing out there. It's what makes people interesting. It's what makes us human. And I agree with you. I think, just sitting from a comedy, as a comedy brand, it's getting extremely difficult, if not outright impossible, to be funny. I mean, you talk to any comedian, you talk to any comic, it's challenging. The comedy can make you uncomfortable. It makes you think. A joke helps you remember something. And the idea of making a joke that is so offensive. So where do you think this comes from?
That's the very deepest question. For those who haven't read him, I would recommend all of Jonathan Haidt's books, but especially The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. I think I got those titles right. I think it's coming broadly from two places. One is we're living through a time of unbelievable transformation, economic and informational. And I think that leads to if you look at the metrics, yes, lots of things in life are getting better. And yet it always feels like we're on edge, right? It feels like it's like Y2K every day, or like the fear of Y2K.
Totally.
And I think a reason for that is this like the digital revolution, the information revolution, and that kind of precarity and sense of like, whoa, like things aren't as they appeared to be, and things are unequal, and things, like why should it be so hard for me to struggle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, leads people to like a fear-based mindset. Like I think when people retribalize, a lot of that is driven by a sense of fear and a sense of like openness to other people is somehow like dangerous for you. So I think that's
threatening.
part of it. I think the other thing, and lots of people way smarter than me have said this in a more articulate way, is like the untold consequences of the death of religion. And living in technically we're living in a secularized society, but it doesn't feel like that, right? It feels like people are actually like extremely orthodox, and that those religious inclinations that in healthy religion is harnessed, in service to other people, is harnessed, for giving people mercy and grace, right now is not being harnessed. And instead, that kind of like religious impulse that like you see in like the Salem witch trials, or you see really throughout history, that's what's rearing its head in ours. Like the religious impulse doesn't go away if people don't go to church. It just gets channeled in another direction. And
it's just applied
it's just getting
differently.
applied in politics, where that's, and like in the culture war, where that is becoming people's church. And in a way that's actually like far more dangerous, I think. And just less, I don't know. It's like people need meaning and people need belonging. And if they're not going to find it in healthy ways, and if they're not going to find it in like the Rotary clubs and the churches and the synagogues that don't exist anymore, they're going to find it in bands of people on Reddit and on Twitter. And that's what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How did you talked about how there was a time where you were crouching, right? Where you physically embodied a lot of what you're talking about from a societal perspective. You are under siege. You're getting hammered on the Slack, you're getting hammered on Twitter, you're getting hammered from your bosses, from your readers, from readers who hate you, from people who've never read you or heard of you, but people are piling on, so why not? How did you make that transition personally to being more fearless and to caring less or caring more? Like, that's what I like about you. I'm like, you care a lot, but I think you also care
so
probably
much.
Yeah, you care a lot.
So much. Like,
yeah.
I am in a way a really sensitive. I'm proud of myself when I look back on the things I published at the Times, because as scared as I often was, I did live by my values, even inside of the New York Times. Like I really, really did that. It's just, it brought a lot of heat my way, but I always did it. I think the thing that has changed for me is, first of all, being in a context where people aren't like calling for you to be fired in Slack channels with thousands of colleagues, or like putting X and guillotine emojis next to your name. Like that's just a healthier, better life. So I think
seems like a better workplace environment. What did HR say? Sorry, I did you ever go to HR? I can't remember if you covered this.
I didn't.
Sorry, I don't mean to insult you.
You don't need to go to HR when the thing is happening in front of the publisher and the editor of the newspaper. Like they're in that Slack channel praising people for their moral courage.
The HR people are like doubling down on the fire guillotine
right. And the
emojis.
other funny thing about the Times is people are like, tell me what went on. And I'm like, I don't need to tell you. Go on Twitter. It all happens in public. Like it's a very strange a thing. I think that being clear with myself about what my values are, and frankly, like what I'm willing to leave a prestigious job for, what I'm willing to lose friends for, what I'm willing to like, in my small ways sacrifice for, but in a grander scale, like really asking yourself, like, what is your life about? And what are you willing to give it up for? Or at least give up parts of it that seem crazy to other people. I know what those things are for me. And so the more I'm able to like keep those at the forefront of my mind, the more I'm able to be courageous to the extent that I'm able to be courageous. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would say to like, when you're referencing, and I know so many of them because we're living out in LA, like the comedians that are scared to tell jokes, or the people that are really living like different lives in public than they are in private, that should be enough evidence for people that we're going down a very bad direction. If you feel that you can't tell a joke in private, if you feel you can't take a risk in terms of speech, if you can't actually exercise free speech anymore, like it turns out like we don't need a dictator to have a version of totalitarianism. All we need is Twitter and a bunch of cowards running the most important institutions in the culture. Take as evidence, like it's enough evidence that we've gone far enough down a bad path that you're scared to speak out loud. Speak now while you can. Like I have absolutely committed myself to that, no matter what. And like people didn't die on the beaches of Normandy so that I would be scared to say basic commonsensical positions on the internet. And like, I just would beseech everyone that like, again, like that's what makes this country at its best exceptional, and not just exceptional right now in the world, but exceptional in human history with all of our flaws. And we're obligated to tell the truth. Like, I really believe that. And like, if the hardest thing that's being asked of us is to get ratioed online, like, we're in a pretty good situation.
We're okay. Yep. Bari, Speak Now While You Can would be a great t-shirt.
That would
from the Bari Weiss collection.
I feel like my friend Bridget Fedesi has something similar, so I have to check. I got to check.
Okay.
I have to check if she's
make you a
trademarked
t-shirt
it,
line,
but
I think. Okay, you should. Oh, you got to get on the trademarking
I
business for all your
appreciate
slogans.
your passion for swag.
For
Yeah.
t-shirts? For
No,
Slack
for
or
swag.
t-shirts?
For t-shirts.
Oh, I love swag. Swag matters, Bari. It's how you create your tribe.
I know.
If you're going to make the normal central people who are like, sometimes I like to make jokes, sometimes I like this, sometimes I like that. If you got to give them an identity so they can fight all the weirdos on the
You're
fringe.
right.
That is your
Oh my
job.
God, I'm going to schedule a meeting tonight with my team of 3 to talk about t-shirts.
Do it. All right. Bari Weiss, thank you so much. You are an inspiration. I appreciate you doing this so much. I'm following up with you, and I'll be sending you some
t-shirts. I can't wait. I'll wear them with pride.
Good luck.
Thank you,
Good
Erika.
luck. All right.
Bye.
Bye, girl.